No one took the quiet nurse seriously. Then, 18 wounded soldiers asked for her. In a military trauma center, the loudest voice usually wins. The sharpest orders, the fastest hands, the biggest rank on the chest. But what happens when the person everyone ignores is the only one who sees death coming before anyone else does? This story is different because it is not just about war blood or heroism. It is about the dangerous cost of being overlooked, and the moment silence turns into survival. Picture the cold glare of trauma lights' boots slipping on polished floors, a monitor screaming in the corner, and one nurse standing in the back invisible until everything starts falling apart. Stay with me because this story builds to a moment you will not forget. If you're here, like the video and comment where you're watching from. And that was the part nobody in Fayetteville would have believed, because 3 weeks earlier, inside Liberty Regional Military Trauma Center, most people barely noticed Lieutenant Claire Morgan when she walked into a room. The hospital sat on the edge of Fort Liberty, like a machine built to absorb violence. Helicopters crossed overhead at all hours. Ambulances rolled under the emergency canopy with their light bars strobing across wet pavement. The automatic doors never stopped opening. Men came in from training accidents, highway pileups, weapons malfunctions, parachute landings, gone wrong, kitchen fires in barracks, bad calls on back roads, and the kind of violence that never made it into official speeches. The smell inside was always the same. Disinfectant coffee left too long on a burner-hot plastic from monitor's iron from old blood and the faint sourness of stress. By 6 in the morning, the trauma floor was already loud. The day, nurses traded reports in clipped voices. Corpsmen pushed supply carts down bright hallways. A resident cursed under his breath while trying to log an order into a freezing computer terminal. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient was groaning through a dressing change. Somewhere else, a monitor chirped in a steady, impatient rhythm that said someone had moved just far enough to peel a lead loose. That kind of place rewarded people who knew how to fill the air. Claire never had. She moved quietly, not timid in her hands, only in her voice. Her charting was exact. Her scrubs were always clean at the start of a shift and never stayed that way for long. Her dark blonde hair was twisted into a tight bun under a plain navy cap. She wore no jewelry except a thin chain tucked beneath her collar and a watch with a scratched face she checked more than anyone realized. She had the posture of someone who had learned early not to take up too much room. She also had a mind that missed almost nothing. At 27, Claire could look at a patient once and retain details other people needed 3 separate chart checks to remember. Scars from old surgeries. Asymmetry in pupils. Fingertip cyanosis. The faint stiffness in a jaw that meant pain was being hidden. The wrong medication hanging on the right pole. A blood pressure that was not dropping fast enough to calm anybody down, but was dropping all the same. She noticed things the way other people breathed. That should have made her indispensable. Instead, it made her easy to use and easy to ignore. The center of gravity on the trauma floor was Major Nathan Cole. Cole was one of those men who seemed to arrive in a room a full second before his body did. His reputation reached corners before his footsteps. He was a trauma surgeon with broad shoulders, a hard Boston edge still tucked into his vowels, and the kind of surgical confidence that made people forgive almost anything. He was quick with a blade, quick with a diagnosis, and even quicker when there was an audience. Nurses admired him, feared him, or both. Young residents watched him the way hungry men watched a door that might open onto power. Cole had a habit of talking while moving. He did not issue orders so much as throw them into the air and expect the room to shape itself around them. Get me blood now. Prep the line. I do not need a discussion, I need a chest tray. People moved. They always moved. At his side, or close enough to feel like an extension of his will, was Chief Nurse Dana Mercer. Dana had done 3 combat tours before most of the younger nurses on staff had finished nursing school. She was compact, hard-built, and carried her authority in a voice that could stop two arguments at once without rising above conversational volume. Her dark hair was cut short for practicality, her expression sharpened by years of running trauma. Under conditions where mistakes did not get corrected, they got buried. Dana respected skill. She respected speed. She respected people who knew what to do before being told. What she did not respect was hesitation, and Claire, in Dana's eyes, looked like hesitation made human. That judgment settled fast and stayed put. On Claire's second week on the trauma floor, Dana had watched her stand beside a multi-vehicle collision patient while a resident fumbled with a chest tube setup. Morgan Dana had said without looking at her, "If you have something useful to add, say it before the man drowns." Claire had swallowed, glanced at the monitor, then at the resident's hands. His rhythm changed. "I think the line is wrong." The resident snapped, "It is not wrong." Dana turned, then finally looking from one to the other. "Claire." Claire pointed small and precise. "That is saline. The label is folded under." He ordered norepinephrine. The resident froze. He checked. She was right. Dana did not thank her. She only said, "Then speak louder next time." But speaking louder was the one thing Claire had never been able to do on command. She had grown up in a small town outside Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where winters sat heavy on the hills, and everybody knew the history of everybody else. Her father had worked maintenance at a paper mill until the place shut down. Her mother taught music lessons out of the front room of their house and always said Claire came into the world listening before she did anything else. She had not been shy as a child exactly. She had simply learned that louder people got believed first. By the time she was old enough to understand how rooms worked, she had stopped trying to compete with them. Instead, she built herself into someone precise. In nursing school, she had spent evenings tracing nerve pathways until they lived in her head like roads in a hometown. In advanced trauma rotations, she remembered every variation an instructor mentioned, every warning buried in footnotes, every side effect too rare for tests, but common enough to kill. During simulation labs, other students narrated their thinking out loud. Claire did not. She just got answers right. Her instructors praised her clinical judgment. They also wrote versions of the same sentence over and over in evaluations. Exceptional knowledge base. Needs stronger verbal command presence. The Army had polished some parts of her and hardened others, but it had not changed the core problem. In a quiet room, one-on-one, Claire could sound calm and competent. In a crowded bay under bright lights with 3 people talking over her, her voice thinned. The words were still there. They just reached the air too late. That was enough for people like Nathan Cole to decide what she was. He never called her incompetent outright. Men like Cole rarely bothered with direct cruelty when casual dismissal did the job more elegantly. During morning rounds, he talked past her as if she were a piece of equipment placed near the bed for convenience. Post-op day 2. Keep pressure off the limb. Repeat labs at noon. Claire would glance at the patient, see the swelling edging higher under the dressing, and say, "Sir, his peripheral pulse is weaker than it was at 6. Cole would keep walking. Then chart it. "I think he may be developing compartment syndrome." The flick of his wrist was almost bored. "I think you should let me think." Then, 3 hours later, he would be scrubbed into emergency surgery while staff admired how quickly he had recognized the complication. Claire would stand at the sink after scrubbing dried blood from under her nails, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. It happened often enough that she stopped expecting anybody to notice. But people noticed more than she knew. The enlisted men noticed first because enlisted men were experts in reading the difference between authority and attention. PFC Noah Bennett came in after a rollover during a field exercise south of Post. He was 19, broad-shouldered, and trying very hard to act like his pain was beneath comment. His shoulder was fractured, his ribs were bruised, and the pain medication made his dreams ugly. On his second night, just after 1 a.m, he woke gasping and swinging at shadows only he could see. The nurse on duty before Claire told him to settle down or she would call for sedation. Noah tried. He really did. Then he started shaking. Claire pulled up a stool beside his bed and lowered herself into it without fanfare. She adjusted the blanket that had twisted around his legs and checked the line in his arm. He stared at the ceiling chest, pumping too fast. "You are not there," she said. Noah laughed once through his panic. "That narrows it down." She looked at him, not annoyed, not indulgent, just present. "You are in North Carolina. 3rd floor, too much air conditioning. That vent above you rattles every 7 minutes. You broke your shoulder. You bruised your ribs. The rest is your body getting confused in the dark." He turned his head, a little eyes wet from exhaustion. "You talk like you have done this before. I have sat with people before. That your clinical term. It is tonight." For the first time since he woke up, his breathing slowed enough for him to listen. She stayed there until the tremor left his hands. She did not mention it in a way that made him feel foolish. She did not tell anyone at the desk that he had nearly climbed out of bed in a cold sweat. By morning, he had decided that if the quiet nurse said a thing was manageable, then maybe it was. 2 weeks later, Corporal Tyler Grant came in after a live fire breach sent a fragment past his cheek and lodged debris near the orbit of his left eye. He was all sharp wit and stubbornness until the ophthalmology consult made the room quiet. Surgery was possible, but so was permanent damage if they chased the fragment the wrong way. The specialists debated. Tyler lay still and listened to men discuss his eyesight like a logistics problem. Claire took over his overnight care. Around midnight, she slipped into the tiny staff alcove with a stack of journals and a tablet connected to a military database that took forever to load. She read case notes from civilian hospitals' irrigation techniques, unusual pressure management recommendations, scattered references that only made sense if you had the patience to stitch them together. Then she mixed a customized sterile flush under standing orders already in the chart, and spent the next few hours irrigating with the gentleness Tyler would remember for the rest of his life. "Are you trying to wash my brain out through my eye?" he muttered at one point. "Only the parts causing trouble. That will take all night. I am on until 7. By dawn, the fragment had shifted just enough to turn a dangerous procedure into a manageable one. The surgeon on the morning team called it a lucky migration. Tyler, squinting through one uncovered eye, looked at Claire and said, "Luck had very steady hands." She almost smiled. Still, none of that changed her status on the floor. In official terms, Claire was a competent trauma nurse lieutenant. In daily practice, she became the person people sent for blood products, extra tubing, missing suture packs, and mop up after the drama was over. "Morgan, can you restock Bay 2? Morgan, run this sample downstairs. Morgan, grab a fresh pulse ox. Morgan, wipe down bed 4. It was not that she refused work. She did more work than most. It was that the work she got trusted with never seemed to include authority. Once, during a double code late on a Friday, Claire noticed an exhausted medic had connected a medication line to the wrong port while trying to keep up with overlapping orders. The patient's heart rhythm made a subtle jump, not enough for the room to panic, enough for Claire's stomach to tighten. She stepped behind the monitor, traced the tubing, corrected the connection, and adjusted the rate before the mistake compounded. Dana glanced over. "What are you doing back there?" "Fixing a line." Dana cross-checked and found the change already made. For a second, her eyes lingered on Claire in a way that almost suggested recalculation. Then someone shouted from the other bay, and the moment vanished. That was how it always went. Claire's competence lived in interrupted moments. The trauma center itself did not help. The place was built around motion and hierarchy. You could feel rank in the air. Attendings barked and interns scrambled. Senior nurses knew which families needed information and which needed boundaries. Corpsmen from the base attached to civilian specialists and tried to prove they belonged there. Every inch of the building trained people to respond to the strongest signal, the clearest order, the person least likely to apologize. Claire apologized even when she was right. She hated that about herself. In the locker room, in the quiet of her car before dawn, in the 5 seconds between the elevator doors closing and opening, she would replay conversations and think of the version of herself who had said the exact same words with enough force to matter. That version of Claire existed in theory. On the floor under pressure, she kept slipping away. One rainy evening after a 16-hour shift, Claire sat alone in the cafeteria with a cup of vending machine soup that tasted like salted cardboard. Across the room, a television played local news with the volume down while captions rolled beneath a weather map. A busboy stacked plastic trays. Somewhere behind her, two residents were arguing about football and pretending not to be terrified of their own inexperience. Claire opened a folder she had pulled from her bag during break and stared at the transfer paperwork inside. Medical Administrative Support Detachment, Landstuhl District Liaison Office, Germany. It was not glamorous. It was not even especially interesting. It was a desk, a schedule, a climate-controlled hallway in a world where nobody would shove her out of the way during chest trauma, because there would be no chest trauma to begin with. No one would need her to cut through noise she could never seem to beat. Her mother would call it peace. Claire looked at the form for a long time. Then her pager went off and she folded the paper back into the folder without signing it. Duty first. It was always duty first. The next 12 hours were all broken bones, one badly intoxicated civilian with a facial laceration that would not stop bleeding, and a sergeant major's wife who screamed at the registration clerk because the valet did not move quickly enough. By sunrise, Claire was back on the trauma floor with stale coffee in one hand and a headache pressing between her eyes. Dana caught her at the desk. Bay 3 needs turnover. Then inventory and central supply. We are short on trauma packs. Yes, ma'am. Dana studied her for a second. You sleeping at all? A little. Try more. Claire almost said I would if people stopped tearing themselves open on your shift. Instead, she just nodded and moved on. Central Supply sat at the far end of the floor, where the hall narrowed and the noise from the bays softened into a constant metallic hum. Shelves climbed the walls with gauze chest seals of Avstart. Kits, airway adjuncts, suture trays, sterile drapes, pressure bags, and sealed emergency boxes marked with color-coded tabs. Claire liked supply rooms because order lived there. Everything had a place. Everything could be counted. Shortages could be fixed by fact rather than politics. She began scanning barcodes and restocking bins, checking expiration dates as she went. From where she stood, she could still hear the floor breathing through the walls. A call bell. A burst of laughter from an off-duty medic leaning too long at the station. The squeal of stretcher wheels needing grease. A helicopter passing low enough to make the ceiling panels tremble. She was halfway through counting trauma shears when Noah Bennett appeared in the doorway wearing a sling and a look of practiced boredom. Are you hiding from people in here, Lieutenant? Or is this an official military assignment? Inventory is official. That is disappointing. I was hoping this was where the sensible staff escaped. Claire kept scanning. Should you be out of your room? My room has daytime television. That does sound dangerous. Noah leaned on the doorframe and watched her work. You ever notice the loud ones always talk like they are in a movie? Claire did not answer right away. Maybe they think it helps. Does it? Sometimes. People hear confidence before they hear accuracy. Noah let that sit. You know everybody on the floor calls Major Cole a legend. I am aware. Some of us think legends should stop yelling long enough to listen. She glanced up then. He was not joking. You need anything before I send you back? She asked. Yeah. He straightened a little. Stop calling yourself just the supply person when you come in at night. I do not call myself that. You do with your face. He left before she could figure out how to answer. That stayed with her longer than she liked. The truth was, she had started believing the version of herself the floor reflected back. Not useless exactly. She knew better than that on good days. But secondary. Peripheral. Good in details not built for command. Somebody better suited for midnight comfort and quiet corrections than moments that required taking the room by the throat and turning it. Sometimes she wondered whether Dana saw the difference between lack of confidence and lack of courage. Sometimes she wondered whether she did. Late the next week, a construction worker came in after a scaffolding fall with crushing pain in his lower leg and a foot turning pale beneath the dressing. Claire checked cap refill, then the pulse at the ankle. Weak. Too weak. The resident assigned to the case was fresh enough to still smell nervous. He needs reevaluation, Claire said. His compartments feel hard. The resident frowned without really touching the leg. He just got pain meds. Pain out of proportion does not vanish because you dislike the explanation. The resident bristled. Are you teaching now? Major Cole entered before the argument could ripen. What have we got? The resident launched into a summary. Claire waited for the opening, then took it. His distal pulse is fading. I think the swelling is building. Cole put 2 fingers on the dressing, lifted an eyebrow, and said to the resident, "Get ortho down here." Good catch. He was already moving when he said it. He had not looked at Claire. Not once. The resident flushed with pleased surprise and hurried off to carry the borrowed credit like it belonged to him. Claire stood very still. The patient, sweaty and fighting the pain, noticed her expression. That was you, right? Claire met his eyes and gave the smallest shrug. What matters is that somebody heard it. But it mattered. It mattered more each time than she admitted. That night after shift, she sat in her car in the employee lot while a summer storm moved over Fayetteville in sheets of silver rain. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel long after she started the engine. Inside the glove compartment was the transfer folder. She took it out, unfolded the paperwork, and read the assignment line again. Germany, a place where everything would be organized, and nobody would ask her to become a person she did not know how to be. She pulled a pen from the cup holder. Then she imagined Noah Bennett waking in a sweat with nobody willing to sit in the dark. She imagined Tyler Grant going into surgery believing luck had saved his eye, because that felt easier than believing a nurse everybody overlooked had done the work. She imagined the next missed pulse, the next mismatched line, the next fragile human body placed in the care of a room too busy admiring itself to listen. Claire capped the pen without signing. At home, she lived in a small apartment off Bragg Boulevard above a nail salon and across from a laundromat that never seemed to close. The place was clean, almost severe in its tidiness. 1 bookshelf, 2 framed photos, a kitchen table that doubled as chart review space when she brought work home in her head. That evening, she stood at the counter eating crackers over the sink because she was too tired to make actual food. Rain tapped the window. Sirens rose and fell in the distance, blurred by weather. Her phone buzzed. Her mother. Claire let it ring twice, then answered. "You sound tired," her mother said immediately. "That is because I am. That hospital is eating you alive. It is not that dramatic. You have sounded 10 years older since you got assigned there." Claire closed her eyes and leaned one palm against the counter. "It is a trauma center, Mom. I know what it is. I also know when my daughter is disappearing into a life that only wants the useful parts of her." Claire let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You always did know how to make things sound simple. They usually are simple. Painful is not the same as complicated." Claire looked at the folded transfer form on the table. Her mother heard the silence. "You still thinking about Germany?" "Yes." "Would that be surrender or relief?" Claire did not answer because she did not know. Her mother softened. "Sweetheart, there is nothing noble about staying where nobody can see you." After the call, Claire sat at the table and stared at the paperwork until the print blurred. Then she tucked it back into the folder and went to bed with the alarm set for 4:45. The next morning broke hot and bright, the rain gone. The sky over Fort Liberty polished clean. By 5:30, the hospital parking lot was already full. Claire walked in with coffee balanced in one hand and the ache of too little sleep behind her eyes. She passed the flag at the entrance, half raised in the faint morning wind, past 2 medics smoking near the loading dock. Past the smell of fresh floor wax from the night crew. Inside the trauma floor was deceptively calm. That kind of calm always felt false. Dana was at the desk reviewing staffing with a pen tapped against a clipboard. Cole had not arrived yet. A resident with a face full of razor burn was trying to fix his scrub cap in the reflection of a dark computer monitor. The air conditioning ran too cold, making the back of Claire's neck tighten as soon as she stepped from the elevator. "Morning," Morgan Dana said without looking up. "You are on support first half. Bay, turnovers, blood bank runner if needed, then supply count. We are short on chest seals again." "Yes, ma'am." No irritation touched Dana's voice because to her this was logical. Put the loudest nurses on direct trauma. Put Claire where Claire could be useful without getting tangled in command traffic. Claire accepted the assignment because she always did. She changed into fresh gloves, checked the blood refrigerator temperatures, counted emergency coolers, confirmed sealed medication boxes, updated a sheet clipped beside the supply alcove, and moved through the back channels of the floor like somebody walking service roads behind a city no tourist ever saw. In Bay 3, the linen still held the shape of the patient discharged an hour earlier. In Bay 1, a tech was wiping down rails while country music leaked softly from his pocket. In the central supply room, Claire lifted boxes, scanned labels, adjusted stock. She liked the quiet there. She liked the way the fluorescent lights buzzed above organized shelves. She liked that supplies did not care who got credit, as long as everything was where it needed to be when the damage came through the door. Around 8:10, she was standing on a rolling step stool counting sealed combat gauze packs on the upper shelf when the first sound reached her. Not the usual trauma page, not the low chime of an incoming ambulance. This was sharper, faster, an alarm that cut through concrete and fluorescent hum alike. Claire froze, one hand still on the shelf. Out in the hall, voices changed pitch all at once. A radio crackled. Feet started moving. Then, the mass-casualty alert hit the overhead speakers loud enough to shake the air in the supply room, and the entire floor lurched from routine into war. The sound swallowed the floor whole. For 1 second, the trauma unit held its breath. Every face turned toward the ceiling speakers as if the walls themselves might explain what was coming. Then, training took over. Chairs scraped back. Clipboards snapped shut. A resident dropped a cup of coffee and left it spreading across the nurse's station without a glance. Somewhere down the hall, a supply cart slammed into a door frame hard enough to rattle glass. The overhead voice came again, clipped and formal, stripped clean of emotion. "Mass casualty activation. All trauma personnel report immediately." Repeat. Mass casualty activation. Claire stepped off the stool and landed lightly, already moving. The radio on Dana Mercer's hip burst to life with overlapping voices. Static, breathing. Fragments of words broken by distance and urgency. Raven Rock Range. Multiple casualties. Structural collapse after controlled breach went live. Secondary detonation. Possible inhalation issue. 18 inbound. 8 critical, 10 unstable. Additional updates to follow. Dana did not waste time asking questions the radio could not answer. Clear every trauma bay. Cancel non-urgent procedures. Call OR and get me 2 open rooms now. Pull blood. Cross-match later if we have to. People peeled away in all directions. Claire came through the supply room door with a box of sealed airway kits in her arms and nearly collided with a corpsman sprinting past. "Where do you want these?" Dana pointed without looking. "Bay 2. Then blood fridge check. Morgan, stay support side." The words landed and passed so quickly they almost missed the heart on the first hit. Support side. Not trauma assignment, not direct care. Not because they did not need hands. They needed every competent hand they had. But Dana's instinct under pressure was the same as always. Put Claire where Claire could help without entering the center. Major Nathan Cole strode in from the surgical corridor, already tying his gown at the waist with one hand while shoving reading glasses into a pocket with the other. There was a brightness in his face that only showed up when the floor turned dangerous. Some people rose to chaos because they were brave. Cole rose to chaos because it matched the speed of his self-belief. "Talk to me," he snapped. Dana gave it to him fast. Raven Rock. 18 inbound. Secondary blast after breach training. Possible crush injuries. multiple critical, unknown inhalation contaminant. Cole nodded once. We run it like mixed trauma until proven otherwise. I want thoracotomy trays ready. Tube setup in every bay. Rapid infusers primed. Anyone who is not touching a patient or a line stays off my floor. His eyes cut across the moving room and found Claire for half a second. Morgan blood and fluids. Do not get in my way. Then he was gone already, barking for ultrasound, suction chest drains, intubation meds. Claire carried the airway kits where they needed to go and swallowed the answer that rose in her throat. There was no point wasting oxygen on protest. Not yet. She crossed to the blood refrigerator, instead checked the temperatures, pulled emergency coolers stacked. O-negative units into rolling bins and lined saline bags along the counter in an order only she would notice mattered. Outside, rotors thudded low enough to vibrate the window glass. The first helicopter arrived before the prep work was finished. The sound came down through the building like weather turning violent. Doors banged. The loading entrance flew open. A flood of motion tore straight through the receiving corridor and into Trauma 1 with medics at full sprint boots, slipping stretcher wheels, squealing voices already hoarse from shouting into rotor wash. Move, move, move. 18 minutes from blast. Tourniquet applied at 0814. We lost one airway in transit. Claire grabbed a blood cooler and ran toward the back wall of the main trauma bay, exactly where Dana wanted her, just outside the circle where orders became authority. Then the casualties came through. The first thing she saw was blood. Not in neat movie smears or isolated pools, but everywhere at once, saturating uniforms, drying black on gloves, flashing bright under fluorescent lights where fresh loss was still moving. The second thing she saw was dust. Gray dust. It coated collars and sleeves, packed into scalp wounds, streaked faces wet with sweat, clung to necks and eyebrows in a greasy film that looked wrong against Carolina mud and training ground dirt. It was too fine, too dark, too uniform across all of them, as if they had been dragged through the same dead cloud. The room filled faster than names could. Stretcher 1 carried a soldier with a twisted lower leg and blood at the mouth. Stretcher 2 came in with a man clutching his own throat, eyes wide, chest pumping too hard. Stretcher 3 was a corporal with half his right pant leg cut away and a field tourniquet dark with blood. Stretcher 4 rolled in with Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed, face ashen under the dust abdomen, wrapped in pressure dressings already seeping through. Claire moved on instinct, handing off blood saline suction tubing, gauze chest trays, whatever the nearest pair of desperate hands needed. She was in motion every second and still somehow saw more than the people anchored at bedsides because she was not trapped inside any single case. Noah Bennett came through on the 5th stretcher. Even under the gray residue, Claire recognized him at once. The same square jaw. The same habit of holding tension in the shoulders even when pain was winning. His left arm was strapped across his chest. There was blood on his sleeve and at the corner of his mouth. A medic ran beside him shouting vitals. Blast injury. Shrapnel left shoulder. Breathing fast. Anxiety through the roof. Possible inhalation. Sate was 91 and falling in transport. Noah's eyes found the ceiling lights and then in one strange flicker of awareness, found Claire by the blood fridge. He tried to say something. All that came out was a choking gasp. He cannot catch his breath, the medic shouted. He was talking 5 minutes ago. Cole cut in from the adjacent bay where he already had gloved hands inside another man's chest wound. Pain and panic. Push morphine, non-rebreather, keep him moving. The medic nodded and reached for the medication tray. Claire's attention snapped to Noah's face. His pupils were tiny, not small from bright light, pinpoint. Black centers shrunk to hard dark dots against the haze of his irises. The detail hit her and stayed. She crossed 2 steps closer with a saline bag in hand and saw the sweat pouring off his forehead in clean rivulets through the dust. Not the cool, clammy sheen of blood loss. This was heavier, wetter, almost unnatural in the chilled air of the bay. The muscles along the side of his neck fluttered under the skin, quick involuntary twitches like static in live wire. A chill moved through her from spine to stomach. Noah was not just scared. He was drowning in something. Lina Corman barked, and Claire handed off the bag automatically without taking her eyes off him. Across the room, Marcus Reed's stretcher slammed against a bay rail. Pressure crashing, someone yelled. Marcus was unconscious, but his jaw was clamped so tightly the muscles stood out along the sides of his face. Foam gathered at the edges of his lips, white against gray dust. A nurse reached to suction him. Another called for more pressure on the abdominal dressing. At the next bay, Corporal Tyler Grant was retching over the side of the stretcher body, jerking in short, brutal spasms that did not fit the shape of simple pain. He had one hand clamped over the stump of a field dressing near his upper thigh while a medic tried to keep him from rolling. Heart rate 46 and dropping, the medic shouted. Blood loss. Cole answered without looking. Push pressure. Get him typed if you can't hang O negative. Claire turned toward Tyler and saw his pupils too. Tiny, fixed, wrong. The room kept moving. Trauma always did. Somebody screamed for a chest tube. Somebody else wanted another unit of blood. Dana was on one side of the bay sorting staff into lanes with cold-efficient precision. You take airway. You are with Cole. No idle bodies in this room. Claire moved between them all like a runner threading traffic, but her mind had begun assembling pieces whether anyone invited it to or not. Pinpoint pupils, profuse sweating, muscle fasciculations, bradycardia, secretions, vomiting. The gray dust on every single uniform. A memory surfaced so sharply it almost changed the smell of the room. 3 months earlier, in a mandatory environmental safety briefing held in a stale conference room near logistics, an Army civilian from range operations had clicked through slides nobody wanted to see. Most of the room had half-watched while answering emails or shifting in their seats. Claire had sat near the back with a notebook open. The speaker had mentioned old buried disposal areas on parts of Raven Rock. Decommissioned materials from a Cold War-era defense program. Most had been cataloged and removed decades ago. Some had not. If underground containment was ever breached by construction or explosion, the risk would be contamination from degraded chemical compounds and particulate release. The slide had changed before anyone asked a question. Claire had written down 2 words anyway. Organophosphates. Cholinergic crisis. She was back in the trauma bay now, pulse climbing. A surgeon on the far side shouted, "He is bradying down." A monitor began pulsing a low warning tone that set her teeth on edge. Claire looked again at Noah. His chest was moving too fast and yet not deeply enough. The muscles between his ribs were working overtime. Saliva glistened at the corner of his mouth. His hands clawed once at the air as if trying to pull open something invisible wrapped around his throat. Shock could make people cold, pale, confused, tachycardic. Blast trauma could make them bleed and gasp and seize in ways that blurred the picture. But this specific cluster repeating bed after bed beneath the same layer of gray powder cut through the noise with terrible clarity. These men had not only been blown apart, they had been exposed. If that was true, then every minute they spent treating this like straightforward trauma narrowed the exit. Claire crossed toward Cole through a gap between 2 stretchers. Major Cole. He did not look up. If this is not blood, save it. Sir, their pupils are pinpoint. Multiple patients. Excess secretions, fasciculation, slow rates. I think this may be chemical exposure. Cole's head came up then, but only because the sentence offended him. This is a blast event, Lieutenant. Yes, sir, but the dust on them is not normal range debris. Dana stepped in before Claire could say more. Morgan, back off. He is managing criticals. Claire held her ground 1 second too long. Sir, if this is organophosphate, then pressors could make the wrong problem worse. Cole stared at her, as if he had just discovered a janitor criticizing an orchestra conductor mid-concert. Are you doing toxicology rounds now? No, sir. I am telling you I think they are showing cholinergic signs. He turned away from her in the same movement. You think wrong. Get me another cooler. The dismissal landed in full view of 3 nurses and a medic. No one said anything. No one ever did when rank made reality inconvenient. Claire stepped back because bodies still needed blood, and the room would not pause for wounded pride, but the sense of wrongness in her chest only tightened. She ran a cooler to Bay 2 and nearly collided with Tyler's stretcher again as the team repositioned him. He was still vomiting. A nurse wiped his mouth with gauze and swore under her breath. His tourniquet held in flight, the medic shouted. Blood loss should not have him this low. Claire saw Tyler's calf muscles jump in sharp irregular ripples beneath soot and sweat, the kind of movement no conscious mind controlled. He caught her sleeve with 2 fingers. "Lieutenant," he rasped. She bent automatically. "I am here." His voice scraped like metal. "Feels like my chest is shrinking." The words went straight through her. She glanced toward Cole. He was at Marcus Reed's bed now, calling for more fluids, while a resident pressed down on the abdominal dressing. Marcus suddenly lurched under their hands. "More suction," someone shouted. Foaming. "Pressure's gone." A slow, heavy dread uncoiled in Claire's stomach. Trauma was obvious. Chemical injury was still hiding inside it, and because it was hidden, everyone in authority was naming the wrong enemy. A corpsman thrust a stack of tubing at her. "Need this in Bay 4. She took it, delivered. It swung back toward Noah and stopped dead. The morphine had not been pushed yet. The syringe sat in a gloved hand waiting for confirmation, while the team repositioned his oxygen mask. That should have eased her. Instead, it sharpened the contradiction. Noah's pupils were already pinpoint before opiates touched him. Noah gave a strained, choking sound under the mask. His chest hitched. Froth gathered faintly at his lips. Claire leaned toward the corpsman with the syringe. "Hold that." He frowned. Doctor ordered. "Hold it 1 second." Dana heard the edge in Claire's voice and turned. "Morgan." Claire forced herself not to flinch. "Look at his eyes." Dana gave the shortest possible glance. "He is in pain." "No, ma'am." "Look at all of them. They are drenched in sweat. They are bradying. They are twitching. This is not just blast trauma." Dana's expression hardened. "You are support today. Stay in your lane." Claire almost said the lane is on fire. What came out instead was, "If I am wrong, we lose seconds. If I am right, we lose them." Dana stepped closer, voice low enough not to carry. "Do not undermine a trauma lead during a mass casualty unless you are ready to own the consequences." The sentence struck a nerve because that was exactly what Claire had never been good at. Owning the room. Owning the interruption. Owning consequences in public where the bold thrived and the hesitant got buried. For half a heartbeat, she felt herself begin the old retreat inward. Then Noah Bennett convulsed. His whole body bowed against the stretcher oxygen mask, slipping sideways, heels digging into the mattress. The monitor pitched into a frantic alarm. The corpsman jumped. Someone cursed. Cole shouted from across the bay. What happened? Bed 5 seizing. Cole moved in, scanning Noah's wounds with fast, practiced eyes. Hypoxia and pain cascade. "Push the morphine and get me a better seal on that mask. I want oxygen suction, and if he bottoms out, I tube him." Claire heard it as if from underwater. Wrong problem, wrong sequence. Noah's lips had taken on a dusky blue tinge. His neck muscles were firing in desperate chords. Saliva was pooling despite the suction. Every sign screamed the same diagnosis louder than her own voice ever had. She turned from Noah and searched the room again, forcing herself to see pattern, not panic. Marcus Reed now had a pulse in the 30s. Tyler Grant was retching and shaking, airway gurgling. 2 more soldiers on the far side were sweating through the dust with eyes squeezed half shut against some interior assault no one was naming. This was not one anomaly. It was a system-wide exposure playing under the surface of shredded flesh and broken bone. Claire moved back toward Cole again, this time cutting directly across his line of sight. "Sir, please." Raven Rock had flagged buried disposal zones. There was a briefing on old chemical materials. "This is textbook organophosphate." Cole looked at her then with the full force of his impatience. Textbook does not bleed out on my floor, Lieutenant. It suffocates. I said enough. He stepped around her to reach for epinephrine. The sight of the syringe in his hand made the bay seem to narrow. Claire felt the exact instant fear and certainty collided inside her. Fear said rank. Fear said chain of command. Fear said the report afterward, the hearing, the humiliation, the possibility that she was wrong in the worst possible way. Certainty said Noah's pupils, Marcus's foam, Tyler's vomiting, the gray residue on every uniform, the briefing slide, the smell of secretions under blood. Dana saw her still standing there and pointed toward the back wall with a gloved finger sharp as accusation. Morgan, either bring supplies or get out of this bay. Claire took one step back because bodies surged between them and another stretcher came in from the corridor carrying a soldier with dust matted into a scalp wound and tears pouring from eyes squeezed almost shut. Lacrimation. Another piece. The medic beside him coughed hard into his sleeve and shouted, "They all came out of the same dust cloud." Claire spun toward him. "What did you say?" The medic was too busy keeping pressure on a shoulder wound to realize what he had just handed her. Breach went off wrong. Then the ground opened. Gray cloud rolled through all of them. "We thought concrete or old burn pit ash." "Sir, I need hands here." Gray cloud. The phrase landed like a verdict. Claire felt her pulse in her fingertips. A nurse reached over her shoulder for a bag of saline and snapped, "If you are not using it, move." She moved. She had no choice. The bay kept demanding action from every direction. But now the diagnosis was no longer a hunch built from scraps. It had witness, mechanism, pattern, time pressure. She ran to the pharmacy alcove and rifled through what was accessible from memory. Standard trauma meds, sedation, pressors, crash cart, no chemical antidotes out in the open. Those were in restricted emergency storage under seal because no one expected to need them at a hospital this close to home. A young resident saw her searching and called, "What are you looking for?" "Mark kits, atropine, oxime." He stared at her. "For what?" "For the thing killing them before the blood does." He blinked once, too slow, and then Dana's voice cut through from across the room. "Morgan, now." Claire closed the cabinet and went. The bay had grown hotter despite the air conditioning. Bodies packed the floor. Used wrappers and bloodied gauze littered the ground under boots. Alarms overlapped in impossible rhythms. Someone was crying out for his mother with such raw force it pierced even through the machinery. Noah Bennett was worse. His eyes rolled half-closed under the mask. The muscles in his jaw fluttered. The corpsman at his side finally looked uncertain. "His SATs are dropping despite flow," he said. Cole did not turn. Then bag him. That much secretion. Then suction faster. Claire stepped in close enough to see Noah's lashes beaded with sweat. "Noah?" His eyelids twitched. "Can you hear me?" The answer was a faint choking sound. His fingers curled weakly toward the rail where her hand rested. Claire remembered him in the supply room doorway, joking about sensible staff hiding from people. She remembered him half asleep under the rattle of the vent as she grounded him back into the room, one detail at a time. She remembered her mother saying there was nothing noble about staying where nobody could see you. Not seeing had become its own form of violence in this bay. At the next bed, Marcus Reed's monitor sagged lower, each beep farther apart. Heart rate 32, a nurse called. "Push Epicol," shot back. Claire turned so fast she nearly lost balance on a strip of torn packaging underfoot. "No," she said. It was not loud. The room still heard it. Cole wheeled toward her, rage rising now because she had crossed from nuisance into open contradiction. "What did you say?" Claire could feel every eye that had a spare second landing on her. The old reflex to disappear clawed once at the back of her throat. She pushed past it. They are not just in shock. Their parasympathetic system is locked on. The dust cloud was contaminated. If you keep treating this like standard hemorrhagic collapse, you are missing the cause. Dana came between them, not fully blocking, but enough to make the hierarchy visible. "Lieutenant Morgan, step out right now." Claire looked from Dana to Cole and knew with a clarity so clean it almost felt cold that they were about 30 seconds from throwing her off the floor. Then Noah's body seized again. This time, the oxygen mask slid off completely. A wet, choking rattle came out of him, awful and thick. The courseman swore and reached for suction. On the far side, Tyler gave a strangled cry and bent around pain no one could medicate correctly yet. Marcus's monitor pitched toward a continuous tone. Claire looked at the door to restricted pharmacy storage, then back at Noah, then at the syringe in Cole's hand, and in that instant the whole room seemed to split down the middle between the rules that had kept her small and the truth that was about to kill 18 men if she stayed where she had always been told to stand. She did not step out of the bay. She turned toward the rear cabinets and started running. She ran hard enough that one shoulder clipped a hanging IV pole and sent it rattling into the cabinet beside her. The restricted pharmacy lockbox sat inside a steel wall unit at the rear of the trauma bay, sealed behind a clear plastic strip meant to make access obvious and accountable. Claire reached for it with hands that should have been shaking by now. They were steady. Her pulse was not. It pounded so violently against her ribs she could feel it in her throat. The rest of her, the part that mattered, had gone still. Every sound in the room seemed to sharpen and flatten at the same time. The alarms, the rotor thud fading outside, boots on tile, somebody crying out through an oxygen mask, somebody else cursing because a line would not flush. Her own breathing clipped and controlled. Behind her, Dana's voice cut through the noise. "Morgan." Claire ignored it and yanked the plastic seal free. It snapped with a loud, dry crack. A few heads turned. Inside the cabinet sat the emergency chemical response kits packed in foam, untouched enough to look almost ceremonial. She grabbed the first tray, then the next fingers finding atropine auto-injectors and oxime kits by shape rather than sight. A corpsman near the doorway stared at her. "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" "Saving time." Dana was coming toward her now. Claire could hear it in the rhythm of her steps, fast and direct. Morgan put that back. Claire turned with the injectors clutched in both hands. Across the room, Noah Bennett convulsed again, body bowing off the stretcher oxygen mask hanging loose wet, choking sounds bubbling out of him while the corpsman tried to suction faster than the fluid returned. Marcus Reed's monitor dipped lower. Tyler Grant retched hard enough to pull against the hands holding his shoulder down. The sight erased the last fragile thread of hesitation. Claire moved. Dana caught her at the edge of the lane and seized her arm. "Do not do this." Claire met her eyes, and for the first time since arriving at Liberty Regional, she did not look away. "If I do not do this, they die." Dana tightened her grip. "You do not get to make that call." Claire pulled free. The motion was not violent. It was absolute. She crossed the final steps to Noah's bed, while Major Cole turned to saw the injector in her hand and went white with fury. "Lieutenant Morgan, stand down." Noah's chest hitched again, shallow and useless. The muscles in his neck fluttered beneath the gray dust. His pupils were still pinpoints. Claire put one knee against the rail, found the outside of his thigh through the torn uniform, and drove the injector down. The click sounded much too small for the size of the decision. For 1 second, the entire bay seemed to recoil around it. Dana froze. The corpsman at Noah's side stared at the spent device in Claire's hand. Cole took 2 strides toward her, disbelief breaking into rage. "What the hell did you just do?" Claire tossed the empty injector aside and reached for a second. "Atropine. You medicated my patient without authorization." He was drowning. Cole lunged for her wrist. 2 medics, running purely on reflex, moved in from either side and caught Claire by the arms. Dana's face had gone rigid with a kind of fury born from terror. "Get her off the floor." Claire did not fight the medics. Fighting would waste seconds. She planted her heels and kept her eyes on Noah's monitor. "Watch him," she said. Cole was already reaching for the epinephrine syringe again. "You have lost your mind. Watch him." Noah's heart rate had been sinking in ragged intervals. Now, under the shrill pulse of the monitor, the rhythm changed. Not dramatically at first. One beat found its place, then the next. Then the spacing widened into something less desperate, less broken. The oxygen saturation, which had been sliding despite flow, hesitated. Noah gave a wet cough that sounded uglier than breathing should, and then dragged in a breath so deep and ragged the entire Corsman team looked up. The secretions eased. The muscles in his neck stopped firing in frantic waves. Cole stared. The corpsman with the suction catheter lowered it half an inch. "Sir." Claire wrenched one arm free from the medic on her left and pointed at Noah's eyes. "Look." Cole bent without meaning to pull back one eyelid, and saw the pupil widening not all at once, but enough to rip the certainty out of his face. Noah took another breath. Still rough. Still far from normal. But his chest expanded this time instead of fluttering against a locked throat. "The airway is opening," the corpsman whispered. For a moment, nobody in the room spoke. Then, Marcus Reed's monitor slammed into a flat, continuous tone. The spell shattered. Bed 4, no pulse. The team around Marcus exploded into motion. A resident climbed onto a stool for better compressions. Another nurse reached for the crash cart. Cole turned toward the sound, still holding the epinephrine syringe like a relic from a collapsing religion. Claire tore the second injector free from the tray and ran. "Hold compressions," she snapped. The resident looked at her as if she had gone insane. "Are you serious?" 3 seconds, off him. Cole came in behind her, breath hard now, certainty cracking around the edges. Marcus's jaw was locked foam still gathering at one corner of his mouth, the line on the monitor a cold, unwavering bar. Claire did not wait for formal permission this time. She drove the injector into Marcus's thigh and counted under her breath while holding it in place. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When she pulled it free, she looked up at the resident. "Resume." Now. Compression started again, brutal and rhythmic. Dana arrived at the foot of the bed. Her gaze flicked from Marcus to Noah, where the corpsman team was now working in a very different kind of silence. "Cole," she said. He did not answer right away. Claire did. "We need oxime behind the atropine, and we need mark kits on everyone with cholinergic signs, not later. Now." Cole looked at her then. Not as background, not as support staff, not as a problem. He looked at her the way a man looks at an unfamiliar road after the bridge behind him collapses. How many? All of them who were in the dust cloud and showing symptoms. Pinpoint pupils, sweating, secretions, vomiting, fasciculations, bradycardia. We treat the exposure first or trauma management fails on all of them. Dana's eyes sharpened, recalculating faster than grief or pride could keep up. Chemical locker is rear cabinet 2. Claire nodded once. Open everything. Marcus's line twitched. A single spike cut up from flat silence. Then another. The resident doing compressions stopped on instinct and looked up in disbelief. "Resume," Cole barked. The resident resumed. Claire grabbed a pre-filled oxime syringe from the tray and shoved it into the hands of the nurse at Marcus's line. "Push this." The nurse took it without argument. That, more than anything, told Claire the room had changed. Noah coughed again behind her, stronger this time. One of the corpsmen shouted, "He is moving air." Dana spun toward the cabinet, ripped open the second tray, and began throwing injectors to whoever had the balance and nerve to catch them. "Anybody who cannot identify the signs gets out of my bay," she said. "If Morgan points at a stretcher, you dose it. Move." The words hit the room like a change in weather. A minute ago, Claire had been one order away from removal. Now, Dana Mercer herself was handing out the tools Claire had torn from restricted storage. Cole straightened slowly and looked from Marcus's returning rhythm to Noah's clearing airway, and then at the dust-coated men filling every bed. "Everybody listen up," he roared. The room stilled just enough. New protocol. Suspected organophosphate exposure. Hold epinephrine unless I call it. Mark kits to any patient with secretions, bradycardia, pinpoint pupils, uncontrolled vomiting, fasciculations. We cleared the chemistry first. A resident near the far bay blinked. "Sir, all of them." Then dose all of them. The bay erupted again, but differently now, less random. more jaggedly purposeful. Claire moved to Tyler Grant. He was half-twisted on the stretcher, one hand weakly gripping the side rail, vomit stringing from his mouth as the medic tried to keep the oxygen mask in place. His skin gleamed with sweat through the gray residue on his face and throat. Tyler saw her and tried for a grin that collapsed halfway into a grimace. "You look mad." "I am busy." "That better." "A little." She found the injection site and pressed the device into his thigh. He sucked air through his teeth when it fired. That was rude. She held it in place, counting. "Keep breathing." "I am trying, Lieutenant." "I can see that." The medic beside him had stopped arguing with the room and started watching Claire's hands like a man learning a new language by firelight. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked. Claire did not stop moving. Pupils first, then secretions, then the mismatch. Too much fluid from everywhere, heart rates too low for the blood loss. You are seeing muscles twitching under the skin. If they were all in the same gray cloud, assume exposure until the pattern proves otherwise. He nodded hard and repeated the signs to himself under his breath as if engraving them in place. Across the bay, another nurse shouted, "This one is pouring sweat, but pressure's still decent." "Dose him," Claire answered. A corpsman near the far wall called, "His eyes are tiny. Heart rate 40. "Dose him." Someone else younger, uncertain, "What if it is just pain?" Dana cut in before Claire had to. "If Morgan says dose him, you dose him." Claire barely heard it. She was already moving again, bed to bed, the room opening lanes for her now without needing to be asked. The fear that had ruled so much of her life had not vanished. That surprised her. It was still there somewhere deep and hard, cataloging consequences, whispering about reports and boards and careers. It simply had no authority in her body anymore. Not while 18 men fought for air. At the next stretcher, a specialist with a scalp wound and tears streaming involuntarily down his face thrashed against his straps. "Get me out of here." Claire put a hand flat against his sternum, just long enough to hold him in the room. "You are in Liberty Regional. You are safe. I know it does not feel like that. Hold still. I cannot see right. You do not need to see right this second. You need to breathe." She dosed him and moved on. Noah Bennett reached weakly for her sleeve as she passed back through his bay. His chest was still heaving, but the rhythm had changed. Less trapped, less panicked. The corpsman, managing his airway, looked stunned. She was right, he said to nobody and everybody. Claire did not stop. "Keep suction going. Watch his chest. If secretions climb again, call me before you call for another presser." He nodded, as if that were now the most natural instruction in the world. Marcus Reed's monitor was no longer flat. Irregular, yes. Fragile, certainly. But alive. Dana stood at his line, adjusting a drip, and looked up as Claire approached. "Oxime in. Good. Watch for recurrent twitching. If the secretions do not dry, he may need another atropine dose." Dana held her gaze one beat too long. In that look sat apology, shock, and a soldier's hard respect, all colliding under pressure with no time to sort themselves into language. Dana said only go. Claire went. 2 bays down, a private with shrapnel across his flank was seizing so hard the rail pads were slamming against metal. A resident held his shoulders while cursing at the monitor. His rhythm is all over the place. Claire checked the eyes, the sweat, the jaw tension. He gets a kit. The resident snapped, "I need a physician order." Claire took the injector from his tray and put it in his hand. "Then take mine as the person keeping him alive while you wait to be comfortable." The resident stared, then jammed the device down with more force than necessary. "Good," Claire said, already turning. "Now push the oxime after." The room had reached that strange point mass-casualty setting sometimes reached where terror burned clean into concentration. The screaming did not stop. The blood did not stop. The suffering did not become smaller. It simply arranged itself around purpose. Cole was at the center of the bay again, but not in the way he had been 20 minutes earlier. He was still loud, still fast, still the surgeon with the room in his lungs. Only now his voice carried Claire's map. "Check pupils before you call it shock." If he is gurgling, do not wait for me. Any recurrent fasciculations tell Morgan. The fact that he used her name out loud with no contempt in it almost did not register, because there was no space left inside her for surprise. A nurse from another floor, pulled down by the alert and sweating through borrowed scrubs, grabbed Claire's elbow as she passed. "Lieutenant, I have two over here. One is bradying, one is tacky, but pouring sweat." Claire scanned both in under 3 seconds. Brady first. His airway will go before his blood pressure tells the story. The nurse nodded and repeated the order to her partner. At the back wall, the opened trays were emptying fast. Claire ran there, tore through the next foam insert, and found more injectors. Her fingers were now slick with sweat and somebody else's blood. She wiped them once against the front of her scrub top and kept going. Dana appeared beside her, breathing hard. "You were in that range briefing." Claire looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "I was not." "No, ma'am." Dana took 2 injectors and tucked them into the pocket of her scrub top. "Then, from this second on, you tell me what I missed." Claire handed her 3 more. "Secondary doses if they do not improve. Watch airway secretions. Watch the rates. The trauma is still real, but the chemistry is lying to us about what kills first." Dana gave one short nod and vanished back into the lanes. Claire turned and nearly ran straight into Major Cole. He was close enough for her to see the sheen of sweat along his temples and the blood drying dark around one cuff. Up close, he no longer looked angry. He looked stripped. "Talk to me," he said. The words were rough, not because he was trying to humble himself, but because the room had finally beaten pretense out of him. Claire answered without hesitation. "Atropine to block the receptors and dry the secretions. Oxime behind it to break the bond if we still have time. Anyone with airway compromise gets first priority, because if the lungs fail, the rest does not matter. The severe bleeders still need the OR, but not until we stop the chemical from shutting them down." Cole listened. Every person within earshot knew what that meant. "Who is first for surgery once you clear them?" he asked. Claire pointed across the bay without turning. "Tyler Grant, if the tourniquet slip keeps soaking through. Marcus, if the abdominal dressing blows. Noah can hold if his chest opens and his oxygen stays up. The one in Bay 7 is fooling everybody. His left side is not moving right. Needle him if breath sounds drop." Cole stared for half a beat, absorbing the fact that while he had been fighting the obvious wounds, Claire had somehow seen the whole room. Then he nodded. "Fine." He turned and bellowed, "You heard her." The room moved faster. Claire crossed back to Tyler. The medic at his side was suctioning less now. Tyler's breathing still hurt to watch, but his eyes tracked her more clearly. "Thought you were the quiet one," he rasped. Claire adjusted the mask seal with quick, careful hands. Quiet was not working. A weak laugh caught in his throat and turned into a cough. "Keep that line open," she told the medic. "Tell me the second the dressing darkens faster." The medic glanced at Tyler's pulse, then at Claire. "I will." By now, the first wave of atropine was showing everywhere you looked, if you knew what you were seeing. Chests moving with a fraction more room. Froth receding. Twitching softening. Eyes widening from those terrible pinpoints. It was not magic. Some men were still bleeding badly, some were still hanging over the edge. But the room was no longer blindly feeding the wrong fire. Claire passed Noah again, and he managed through the mask 2 clear words. "Knew it." She bent closer. "Knew what?" "That you were not supply." The breath that left her was almost a laugh, almost a sob, neither one useful enough to keep. She squeezed his shoulder once and moved on. A sudden shout rose from the far corner. "Bed 7." Dropping breath sounds on the left. Claire turned immediately. The private she had clocked earlier was going gray around the mouth. She pointed before anyone else fully processed it. "Chest decompression, now." The resident hesitated only until Dana barked, "Do it." The needle went in. Air hissed. The private's chest lifted easier on the next breath. Dana looked across the bay at Claire and did not bother hiding the respect in her face anymore. For the first time since she had arrived at Liberty Regional, Claire Morgan was no longer standing at the edge of the room. She was the room, and under the cold, fluorescent lights with blood on the floor and open antidote trays at her feet, and 18 wounded soldiers balanced between trauma and poison, every voice that had once talked over her was finally listening. Once the first round of antidotes was in the room did not become easier. It became more honest. The men on those stretchers were still torn open. Bones were still broken. Blood still soaked field dressings and pooled under rails. The difference was that the enemy had a name now. The hidden thing, suffocating them, had been dragged into the light, and with that came a new kind of work, the kind that demanded precision instead of panic. Claire stood at the center of it, breathing through the taste of metal and hospital air, and began to divide the room in her mind. Who was failing because of chemical exposure? Who was failing because of blood loss? Who was failing because the two disasters had collided inside the same body? That last group was the worst. Tyler Grant belonged there. So did Marcus Reed. So did at least 4 others before the hour was out. The first surge of atropine bought them space, not victory. Secretions loosened. Airways opened enough to stop the immediate drowning. Heart rhythms that had been dragged toward the floor began to claw upward. But the antidotes themselves came with their own complications, and trauma did not pause to let medicine catch its breath. Claire crossed back to Marcus Reed just as his monitor began to misbehave again. His pulse had returned, but it was fragile, swinging between bradycardia and sudden lurches of compensatory speed as his body fought through shock, blood loss, and chemistry all at once. His abdominal dressing was soaked through to a dark, heavy maroon, and one corner had begun to peel loose under the pressure of frantic hands. Dana was at his side, pushing down with both palms. "He needs the OR," she said, not looking up. "He does," Claire answered. Marcus's jaw flexed. A twitch rippled down the side of his neck. Claire leaned in. Did he get the full oxime dose? Dana glanced toward the line. He got the first push. His fasciculations are coming back. Dana swore under her breath. Cole was across the bay, elbows deep in another crisis. But Claire did not need him for this decision. "Hang another dose," she said. "If the twitching wins, he loses his airway before surgery gets the chance." The nurse at the IV hesitated for half a heartbeat, then moved. That was how it was now. Claire no longer had to force every sentence through a wall of disbelief. People still looked at her with shock now and then, as if each correct instruction required a recalibration of the world, but their hands followed anyway. At Tyler's stretcher, a medic stripped back the makeshift wrap at the top of his ruined leg and went pale. "Pressure dressing is blown," he called out. "Tourniquet's not holding clean." Tyler was sweating so hard his hair had plastered to his forehead. He looked like a man trying to stay conscious by sheer insult. "That is not a real medical face," he muttered when Claire bent over him. She checked his pupils. Better. She checked his chest. Breathing still labored, but less trapped than before. Then she looked at the dressing and felt the shape of the problem settle into place. The initial antidote had done what it needed to do. The chemical storm was loosening its grip. Now blood was taking over again. "Cole," she called. His head came up immediately. That small fact almost disappeared under the flood of the moment, but it was there all the same. He heard her now. He is bleeding past the tourniquet. Cole crossed to the bed in 3 strides and ripped back the dressing with her. Blood welled dark and fast. "He goes now," Cole said. "He cannot tolerate a full general yet." Cole's eyes flashed to hers. "He cannot tolerate this either." Claire was already running through options before he finished the sentence. Tyler still had residual secretions, though less than before. His respiratory drive was compromised, not collapsed. Put him under too deep, and they might never get him back. Keep him awake with uncontrolled pain, and his body would burn through what little reserve it had left. "We do a regional block," she said. "High femoral. Ultrasound guided. Keep him breathing on his own, small ketamine if we need it. Nothing that buries his airway." Cole did not answer immediately. Around them, the bay screamed and clanged and breathed. Dana was calling for more blood in one corner. A resident was cutting away a boot in another. Somewhere behind them, a monitor trilled out a warning, so constant it became part of the architecture. Cole looked at Tyler's leg, then at the secretion still wetting the edge of his oxygen mask, then back at Claire. "Can you place it?" "Yes." "While he is moving?" "Yes." Cole nodded once, or two. "Move." The transfer happened at a dead run. Tyler was wheeled through double doors under banks of white light, while Claire walked at the head of the stretcher. One hand on the oxygen line, the other steadying the rail every time a wheel hit a seam in the floor hard enough to jolt his body. Tyler's eyes found hers. "Are we doing the fun version or the terrible version?" "The efficient version." "That sounds made up." "It is what we have." He tried to grin and failed. "I trusted you more when you were meaner." "You are talking. That is good." "That is one opinion." Inside, or two, the air was even colder than the trauma bay, sharp with prep solution and stainless steel. The overhead lamps turned skin into something almost unreal. A tech clipped monitors into place while anesthesia hovered at the foot of the table, deeply unhappy with every available choice. "He needs to be intubated if you expect me to keep this controlled," the anesthetist said. "He needs to keep breathing on his own if you want him alive in an hour," Claire answered. The anesthetist opened his mouth to push back. Cole cut him off without looking up from the scrub sink. "We are not debating physiology while he bleeds. Minimal ketamine only." Morgan places the block. Every face in the room shifted toward her for a beat. Claire, scrubbed in, took the ultrasound probe and moved to Tyler's side. His good hand was gripping the edge of the table hard enough to blanch the knuckles. She leaned close so he could hear her without having to fight the room. "Look at me." He did. "You are going to feel pressure. Then less. I need you still." "Still is not really where my body is at." "I know. Stay with me anyway." She pressed the probe to the upper thigh and watched the grayscale world bloom on the screen. Layers of tissue. Shadowed channels. Bright nerve structures that looked almost delicate until you remembered what pain could travel through them. Behind her, Cole was already gloving in, waiting for the window she promised him. Tyler's breathing hitched. "Almost there," Claire said. "You say that like you believe it." "I do." She advanced the needle. The room narrowed to the screen, to anatomy, to millimeters that separated relief from disaster. Tyler twitched once under the tension of his own body, and two medics held him as still as they dared. Claire adjusted the angle, found the sheath, and injected. On the monitor, the spread bloomed exactly where it should. "There," she said. Tyler blinked hard. That was weird. Better than the alternative. She checked him again. The rigid pain in his face began to loosen at the edges. Cole stepped in. "You have 20 minutes. He cut. The surgery moved fast and ugly. Clamp, suction, tie off the bleeder, clean the damage enough to keep it from taking the rest of him. Claire stayed at Tyler's head, counting respirations, watching his pupils, measuring every change in the shape of his breathing. When his jaw tightened or his heart rate jumped, she adjusted with words, first medication, second. "You are in North Carolina," she told him quietly when his eyes began to unfocus. Cold room. Bright lights. Ugly ceiling. "You are not back there." He swallowed. "You say that to everybody. Only the difficult ones. Felt more special before that. You are still special." "Good." By the time Cole tied the final vessel, Tyler was still with them. He looked terrible. Pale. Shaking, soaked in sweat and blood and the residue of too much pain. But he was alive, breathing on his own, and when Claire squeezed his shoulder before they rolled him out, he squeezed back. There was no time to feel relief. The corridor outside the OR was full of movement. A corpsman shoved 2 coolers of blood past them. A nurse from the trauma bay met Claire at the doors with panic in her eyes. "Marcus is twitching again." And the one in Bay 7 crashed his pressure after the decompression. Claire stripped one pair of gloves off while walking and was already reaching for another. How long ago? Less than 2 minutes. She was moving before the answer finished. Back in the Bay time had turned thick. There were no clean edges anymore between one crisis and the next. The first hour of chaos had burned away, but what replaced it was no less brutal. This was endurance medicine now. Pattern recognition. Repetition without drift. Tiny corrections that kept men from tipping over after everyone had nearly convinced themselves the worst was done. Marcus Reed's lashes were wet with sweat when Claire got to him. His abdomen was packed and temporarily stable enough to wait for surgical transport, but the muscles around his mouth had started twitching again in small, ugly bursts. Another atropine, she said immediately. Dana was already drawing it up. Marcus's eyes cracked open, unfocused and furious in the way strong men often looked when dragged halfway back from the edge. He tried to speak and managed only a torn rasp. Claire bent close. "You are in Liberty Regional." His eyes shifted to hers. "You flatlined," she said. "I know. You are here now." A flicker of recognition passed through him. Then pain swamped it. He ground out one word. "Men. They are being treated. All 18. He stared at her as if trying to weigh the truth of that inside the fog. "You do not get to die on me after making this much work," Claire said. The corner of his mouth tried impossibly to move. It was not quite a smile, but it was enough. The second atropine dried the returning secretions before they became another full collapse. Dana adjusted the line and stood shoulder to shoulder with Claire for a second longer than necessary. "I should have listened." Claire did not have room for absolution. "Help me keep him stable." Dana nodded once. Done. Hours blurred. A specialist in Bay 6 developed a tension pneumothorax hidden under the noise of chemical exposure and a fractured clavicle. Claire caught the shift in his chest before the resident assigned to him trusted what the monitor was saying. She put a needle into his thorax herself. Hand, steady breath. Even a hard hiss of trapped air answering her instinct before the resident had finished saying he was not sure. A private in Bay 9 stopped responding to verbal cues and began drowning again in his own secretions. The first dose had not been enough. Claire ordered another before suction turned frantic. He pinked up under the mask 1 minute later, and the respiratory therapist who had doubted her at the start of the shift stopped doubting her forever. Noah Bennett stabilized, then destabilized, then stabilized again in smaller, more treacherous waves. Blast trauma to the shoulder, yes. Bruised ribs, chemical inhalation, secretions, panic layered over all of it. Claire kept circling back to him because he was the kind of patient who could fool a tired team into thinking he was fine right before sliding under. Each time she came near, he tracked her with a fierce effort that made her want to tell him to save the strength. At one point, sometime after midnight, he caught her wrist. "They listen now," he whispered through cracked lips. Claire checked his line. "You need to breathe, not talk. Still counts." She looked at him, then really looked. 19 years old. Face smudged with dust and bruising. Breathing because she had refused to obey. Breathing because she had finally trusted the quiet certainty in her own mind more than the volume of everyone around her. She adjusted the blanket over his legs. Rest. That became the rhythm of the night. Move. Check. Correct. Move again. There was blood under Claire's fingernails and across the front of her scrubs and drying patterns she no longer registered. Her hair had come loose at the temples. Her throat burned from air too cold and too recycled. Every time she straightened from a bed, the muscles in her lower back complained, but there was no room in her mind for her own body. The strangest part was how natural command felt once she stopped asking permission to occupy it. She did not bark because she had never been built that way, but she became exact, and exact was enough. People heard her because every sentence she spent carried weight. Not that med. Watch his chest, not the pressure. He is not crashing from blood. He is crashing from secretions. Get another line in before transport. Do not sedate him deeper. Talk to him first. Cole changed too, though less gracefully. He remained loud, because loud was his native language, but the arrogance had been punctured in a place too deep for bluster to cover. He stopped waving away what he did not immediately understand. He started checking with Claire before making calls on the ambiguous cases. Once around 1 in the morning, she found him standing over a soldier with bilateral shrapnel injuries and an irregular pulse. "Could be blood," he said. "Could be." He looked at the sweat on the man's lip, at the pupils, at the subtle twitch under the jaw. And not just blood. Number. He nodded once. Treat both. That was as close to humility as Nathan Cole had likely come in years. By 2:30, the floor had settled into the kind of exhaustion that made mistakes more likely, not less. The dramatic panic was gone. In its place came the slower danger of fatigue. Claire saw it everywhere. A corpsman hanging a line with hands a fraction too loose. A nurse nearly charting a dose in the wrong column. A resident staring at a monitor too long before admitting he did not know what he was seeing. Claire corrected what she could and lent her calm where she had no more medicine to offer. At one bed, she adjusted a pillow under a fractured shoulder because the angle was making breathing harder. At another, she placed a hand over a trembling fist until the fist unclenched. At Tyler's recovery bay, she changed the tone of the room simply by arriving. He was pale with the wreckage of surgery and the loss of a limb. He looked over at the sound of her voice and let out a breath that might have been the first one not anchored in fear. "You still here?" "Yes. Starting to think you never leave." "That would be convenient." He swallowed. "Did they get the others?" "They are fighting." "That is not the same answer." Claire adjusted the blanket over what was left of his leg. "They are alive." His face changed, then the hard joking mask giving way to something younger and more raw. "Marcus." "Alive." "Noah." "Alive." Tyler shut his eyes. 2 tears slipped sideways into his hair. He did not wipe them. She did not call attention to them. She simply stayed until his breathing steadied again. Sometime after 3, Dana found Claire at the blood fridge reloading coolers and shoved a paper cup into her hand. It was coffee burnt nearly past recognition and already lukewarm. Claire took it anyway. Dana leaned beside her against the steel door, both of them standing in the narrow seam between one crisis and another. "I have spent 15 years thinking I could read a trauma bay on sight," Dana said. Claire stared into the cup. "You usually can." Dana let out a dry laugh that held no amusement. Not tonight. Claire did not know what response Dana wanted, or whether she wanted one at all. Dana looked toward the rows of wounded men and the staff still moving among them. "I saw quiet and thought fragile. Saw hesitation and thought weakness. I kept putting you in the back because the back felt safe. The back let me see. It should not have had to." Claire said nothing. Dana rubbed a hand over her mouth, then squared her shoulders again. "After this, nobody puts you back there unless you choose it." The words landed, but Claire had no place to store them yet. The night was still too alive. By 4, the monitors had changed character. There were still alarms, but fewer of the screaming continuous kind, and more of the manageable warnings that could be answered by hands and knowledge rather than desperate luck. Blood pressures began to hold. Airways became less treacherous. Men who had arrived half gone now slept in drugged, exhausted fragments of stability. One by one, surgical transfers moved upstairs or across to the OR suite. One by one, the bays emptied of the worst immediate danger and filled with the quieter work of keeping men alive long enough for daylight. At 4:17, Claire stood at the foot of Noah's bed and watched his oxygen saturation sit at a number that no longer made her stomach clench. He opened one eye. "You look awful," he whispered. "So do you." "Good." "Why good?" "Means I was not imagining tonight." Claire tucked the blanket more securely around his side. "Try sleeping." "That in order." "Yes." He closed his eye again. "Best one I got all night." By 5 o'clock, all 18 were still breathing. Nobody said it out loud at first because people in trauma medicine distrusted luck enough not to name it too early. But the count lived in every face on the floor. 18 in, 18 alive. Against the geometry of the injuries, against the hidden chemistry, against the first terrible assumptions, all 18. When the horizon outside the receiving doors began to pale, from black to dark blue, the bay looked like the aftermath of a storm. Bloody gauze, torn wrappers, empty injectors, Used suction canisters lined like evidence. Staff moving slower now, shoulders heavy, voices sanded down to essentials. Claire leaned back against the blood refrigerator and felt her hands begin to shake. Not a tremor. Not a vibration. A full-body aftershock moving outward from the center once adrenaline finally stepped aside and let the truth of fatigue in. She slid down the cold metal until she was sitting on the floor. The fluorescent light above her hummed. Her knees drew up without asking her permission. For a few seconds, she simply sat there breathing in short, shallow pulls because if she tried to breathe fully, she thought she might come apart. A pair of boots stopped in front of her. Dana lowered a second paper cup into view. Claire looked up. Dana sat down beside her on the dirty floor without caring what rank or decorum had to say about it. For a minute, they said nothing. The coffee steamed faintly between their hands. Then Dana spoke, looking straight ahead at the rows of survivors. "You saved every single one of them tonight." Claire stared at the cup. "We did." Dana turned her head. "Do not do that to yourself. We helped after you saw what the rest of us missed." Claire did not know what to say to that either. Dana spared her. "Drink the coffee." Claire obeyed. It tasted terrible. It was perfect. The stillness did not last. At sunrise, the transport teams arrived. The survivors who were stable enough for transfer were prepped for movement to a larger military recovery wing in Bethesda, where surgery, rehab, and long-term monitoring could happen under less impossible conditions. The floor woke into a second life built around documentation handoff reports, medication reconciliation, chain of custody movement orders, and the exhausting bureaucracy that follows catastrophe like a shadow. Claire rose from the floor before anyone could tell her to and went back to work. She moved among the stretchers as flight medics checked straps and portable monitors. She verified drip rates on the remaining antidote infusions. She resecured a blanket over Tyler's legs. She retaped a line on Marcus's hand. She checked Noah's oxygen one last time and watched him fight the sedation long enough to focus on her face. "You coming with us?" he asked. "Number." His brow furrowed. "Should." Claire gave the smallest shake of her head. "You're going somewhere safer." "That is not what I asked." A medic stepped in with transport paperwork before she could answer, and maybe that was a mercy. Some questions were too large for the minute they occupied. Tyler caught her sleeve as his stretcher rolled past. "You tell them," he said, voice rough with drugs and pain. "Tell who what?" "That I know who did this." Claire looked at him. The effort of keeping his eyes open cost him, but he paid it anyway. Not the report. The truth. She opened her mouth, closed it, nodded once. The ambulances pulled away in sequence. The rotors began again. One by one, the men Claire had spent the night refusing to lose disappeared from the loading bay and into transport. Only after the last vehicle door shut did the floor truly empty. The silence that followed felt artificial. Junior corpsmen started stripping beds. Environmental services rolled in carts heavy with bleach and fresh linen. Daylight turned the windows pale gold and made the blood on the floor look suddenly less like crisis and more like evidence. Claire should have gone home. She should have showered, slept, and let somebody else handle the rest. Instead, she walked to the records office. Every milligram of restricted medication used during the night had to be accounted for. Every emergency chemical antidote removed from sealed storage required chain of custody. Claire had broken open the lockbox with her own hands. Her signature needed to be in the record. More than that, the patients themselves needed accurate documentation. Organophosphate exposure changed follow-up care. It changed monitoring. It changed what later teams would watch for and what risks nobody could afford to miss. The office was a small partitioned room behind the main station, cold from overworked air conditioning and lit by the bluish glow of computer screens. Major Nathan Cole was already inside. He sat at the primary terminal in a fresh pair of scrubs cap off hair flattened with sweat and then roughly dried. He looked older in the morning light. Not wiser, just worn. His hands were on the keyboard. Claire stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I need the terminal," she said. "I have to log the antidote kits." Cole did not move. "It is handled." Claire took one step closer. My access was used. I broke the seal. I said it is handled. His body shifted just enough to block the screen from a casual view, and that small, deliberate movement made her chest tighten. Move. Cole turned in the chair at last and looked up at her. The gratitude she might once have expected was nowhere in his face. Neither was the humility he had worn in flashes during the night. In its place sat something flatter and colder. Calculation. Defensive instinct. The hard shell of a man who had discovered somewhere in the last few hours just how public his failure might become. I wrote the preliminary after-action report, he said. The medical chain is covered. Claire's eyes dropped anyway, catching the edge of the open document before he could minimize it. Prompt identification of toxic exposure by attending surgical lead. Immediate chemical countermeasures directed by Major Nathan Cole. Nurse Lieutenant Claire Morgan displayed emotional instability during active triage and briefly interfered with protocol. For a second, she thought she had misread it from fatigue. Then the words resolved. The room went very quiet. "You are lying," she said. Cole pushed back from the desk and stood. "I am preserving order. You were about to push epinephrine into Noah, and then I adapted. You adapted after I dosed him." His jaw tightened. "You assaulted a patient during a code. I saved him." Cole stepped closer until the room felt too small. "Do you have any idea what happens when command reads that a lieutenant nurse physically overrode the attending surgeon in a mass-casualty event?" Claire held his stare. Her exhaustion made everything feel carved in glass. "I know what happens if command does not read that these patients were exposed to organophosphates. That part is in the report, with your name on the diagnosis." Cole did not deny it. The truth of that was somehow worse than if he had tried to argue. Claire felt anger rise, not hot and explosive, but deep and clean, like something geological shifting under pressure. "You would have killed them." His eyes hardened. "And yet they did not die. Because I stopped you." Cole leaned in, a fraction, voice dropping. "Because this hospital runs on chain of command, Lieutenant. Not on moments, not on instinct, not on one night where you got lucky and mistook recklessness for courage." The words were almost enough to reopen old wounds in the shape they had always taken. Too quiet, too late, too small. But they did not fit anymore, not after the blood and the airways, and the 18 men she had watched claw their way back because she had acted. It was not luck, she said. Cole's expression flickered just once with something near hatred. Not for her exactly, for what her existence now meant to him. "When this goes up the chain, they will read my rank first," he said. "They will read my report. They will see that under extreme conditions I recognized a hidden toxidrome and adjusted care accordingly. They will also see that a junior nurse lost composure and complicated the floor." Claire's hands clenched at her sides. "You think nobody saw. I think nobody who matters will put it in writing." She thought of Dana on the floor beside her with bad coffee and a stare stripped of old certainty. She thought of Noah's whispered voice, Tyler's blood on the OR table. Marcus pulling himself back through Flatline and asking first about his men. Cole saw the thought move through her and pressed harder. "Finish your tour," he said. "Take the Germany transfer if you want it, but do not make a second mistake by imagining last night changed the structure of this place." Claire stood there long enough to understand two things at once. The first was that he was afraid. The second was that fear made men like Nathan Cole dangerous long after the crisis itself was over. She wanted to reach across the desk and tear the report out of the computer. Wanted to force him to say the truth aloud in the same room where he had nearly ignored it to death. Wanted to call Dana in and make him hear himself under another witness's eyes. Instead, she looked at the screen one more time, memorizing every line the way she memorized anatomy-drug interactions, warning signs buried in details everyone else skipped. Then she turned and walked out. The corridor beyond the office was bright with morning and smelled overwhelmingly of bleach. The trauma bays behind her were being reset for the next ordinary disaster. The sky outside the receiving doors was clear. Somewhere down the hall, somebody laughed too loudly from simple relief at being alive and off shift. Somewhere else, a floor waxer whined against polished tile. Claire stepped into the sunlight beyond the loading doors and felt the weight of exhaustion settle over her like wet canvas. For one long moment, she simply stood there, hands hanging empty at her sides, while the heat of the Carolina morning rose off the concrete in the hospital behind her, swallowed the last visible traces of the night. Then she reached into her bag, felt the folded Germany transfer paperwork against her fingers, and stood very still. Claire did not sign the transfer paperwork that morning. She folded it, once slid it back into her bag, and went home with dried blood on her shoes and the taste of bad coffee still clinging to the back of her tongue. She showered until the water ran cold. She slept for 4 hours without dreaming. Then she woke to the same hard truth waiting in the same place. The official report had already started moving. In the days that followed, Liberty Regional returned to its routines with the eerie speed hospitals often used to survive themselves. Fresh trauma came through the doors. Shift schedules rotated. Supplies were restocked. Floors were stripped and waxed until there was no visible trace of the night Raven 6 came in under gray dust and bad luck. The only evidence left sat in computers' medication logs and bodies flown north for surgery and recovery. Major Nathan Cole moved through the halls like a man who had decided repetition could overwrite memory. He spoke with command staff behind closed doors. He answered questions in polished language. He used phrases like rapid recognition and decisive intervention. He never once asked Claire to co-sign his version of events. He did not need to. The structure of the place did that for him. Dana Mercer changed in smaller ways. She stopped assigning Claire to the back automatically. She asked for her judgment in the middle of cases now plainly and without performance, but she said nothing publicly about Raven 6. Whether she was waiting, watching, or building the nerve to go on record, Claire could not tell. They worked side by side under bright lights and tight schedules, both of them carrying the weight of an unfinished sentence. Rumors moved faster than truth. Within a week, people on the floor were whispering about a commendation, a rare survival event. 18 wounded soldiers brought in from a training disaster with hidden toxic exposure and no fatalities. Somebody from the Department of Defense wanted a formal debrief. Somebody higher wanted a face to pin it on. A clean story. A hero in a pressed uniform. Claire heard all of it as if from another room. She charted. She cleaned lines. She corrected medication drips before they became emergencies. She moved through the hospital with the same quiet precision she had always carried, except now the silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like pressure building somewhere beyond sight. Then, on a gray Monday before dawn, 2 military police officers appeared at the nurses' station. The younger one asked for Lieutenant Claire Morgan by name. The entire desk went still. Claire looked up from the chart in front of her and knew at once what everyone else was thinking. Disciplinary review. Formal statement. Chain of command had finally decided what to do with the nurse who broke open restricted medication and countermanded an attending surgeon during a mass casualty event. The older officer's tone was professional, unreadable. "You will gather one bag and come with us now, Lieutenant." Claire set down her pen. She did not argue. She did not ask questions, though questions hit her all at once like cold rain. Had Cole pushed it farther? Had the report become a case? Was her license about to disappear into a hearing room? Was this what fear had been saving her from all her life? Not the act itself, but the aftermath. Dana Mercer came out of Bay 3 just as Claire stood. For a second their eyes met. Dana took in the uniforms, the rigid faces, the one bag order, and something tightened visibly in her jaw. She stepped toward them. "Lieutenant Morgan is on shift." The older officer did not flinch. Not anymore. Dana looked at Claire. "Do you know what this is?" Claire shook her head. Dana seemed about to say something else. Then the station phone rang, and somewhere down the hall a patient started shouting for pain medication, and the moment closed without resolution. Dana only said low enough for Claire alone. "Tell the truth if they ask." Claire nodded once. She packed in silence. A spare set of clothes. Toiletries. The transfer folder from Germany still folded in the side pocket where she had never stopped carrying it. Then she followed the officers out under a sky not yet fully light. The transport north was military all the way through. No explanations. No small talk. A seat in the back of a cargo plane with webbing for walls and engines so loud they turned thought into fragments. Claire strapped in with her duffel between her boots and watched pallets, medics, and equipment blur in and out under red cabin lights. She had plenty of time to imagine the worst. By the time the aircraft touched down in Maryland, she had built and rebuilt the coming humiliation from every angle. She pictured a boardroom, Cole in dress uniform. Her own actions recited back to her as disobedience. Restricted drugs. Broken seals. Assaulting a patient with an unauthorized injection. She pictured herself trying to explain airway secretions and pinpoint pupils to men who had never set foot in that bay and already preferred the officer's report. At the terminal, she was met by another escort and driven straight to the military medical center in Bethesda. The recovery wing was a different world from Liberty Regional. No blast of ambulance doors, no raw smell of incoming trauma. The corridors were wide, polished, climate-controlled. The lights were softer. Machines hummed instead of screamed. The men here were stitched, braced, casted, and sedated into the slower work of surviving what had already happened. Claire did not see any of them. Her escort took her past nurses' stations and quiet rooms and family lounges with untouched coffee down a corridor lined with framed commendations and stopped outside a set of double wooden doors. Command briefing room. The officer gestured toward a bench. Wait here. Claire sat. Inside the room, she could hear the muted blur of male voices, one deeper than the rest, one clipped and practiced. She clasped her hands together to hide the tremor in them and stared at the polished floor. On the other side of those doors, elsewhere in the building, 18 men were alive. That fact sat in her chest like something warm and painful at once. The doors opened at last. A staff sergeant looked down at her. Lieutenant Morgan. Inside. The room was large enough to make a person feel smaller on entry. A long conference table occupied the center. At its head sat General Walter Briggs, broad-shouldered and silver-haired with the sort of stillness that came from decades of other men rising when he entered a room. To his right sat Colonel James Holloway, the investigator, sharp-eyed and clean-lined in his uniform, a thick folder in front of him. On the table between them rested a velvet medal case. Major Nathan Cole stood near the window in dress blues. He turned when Claire entered, and for one bright, ugly second satisfaction touched his face. He thought she had been brought here to confirm his version by contrast. The unruly subordinate. The emotional lieutenant. The nurse who had crossed a line. Claire stopped 3 steps inside and came to attention by habit. General Briggs looked at her over folded hands. Lieutenant Claire Morgan. Yes, sir. His expression gave nothing away. You are cited in Major Cole's report for insubordination, breach of medical chain of command, and disruptive conduct during a mass-casualty event at Liberty Regional on the morning of June 12th. The room was silent after that, not gently, expectantly. Cole stepped in before anyone asked more. General, with respect, the lieutenant was under severe stress. Her actions were erratic. Fortunately, the outcome was favorable. Claire looked at him then, and felt something inside her settle with perfect clarity. Not fear, not even anger. It was the same cold certainty that had taken over in the trauma bay the moment she saw Noah Bennett's pupils. This man would bury the truth as deep as he could if no one made him say it out loud. General Briggs shifted his gaze to her. Lieutenant, do you contest Major Cole's account? Claire heard her own voice come out clear. Yes, sir, I do. Cole's face sharpened. General, this is exactly the instability I documented. Colonel Holloway lifted one hand without looking at him. You will get your turn, Major. Cole stopped speaking. The silence that followed carried a different weight now. General Briggs watched Claire closely. Then give me your account. She took one breath. The words came easier than they ever had under fluorescent lights at Liberty Regional, perhaps because there was no patient dying between sentences now, only truth, and whoever was brave enough to carry it. 18 soldiers arrived from Raven Rock Range, covered in gray particulate residue after a breach failure and secondary explosion, sir. Many presented with traumatic injuries. Multiple also presented with pinpoint pupils, heavy secretions, muscle fasciculations, vomiting, bradycardia, and respiratory compromise inconsistent with blood loss alone. I recognized a likely organophosphate exposure due to a prior environmental briefing regarding buried chemical disposal risk on that range. I reported my concern to Major Cole. He dismissed it and continued standard trauma protocol. When PFC Bennett began to lose his airway, I accessed the emergency chemical kits and administered atropine. Cole let out a sharp breath through his nose. Without authorization. Claire did not look at him. Yes, sir, without authorization, because he was dying. And you are claiming General Briggs said carefully that Major Cole did not identify the toxidrome first. Yes, sir. Cole stepped forward. General, may I remind the board that these recollections come from an exhausted nurse who deliberately violated direct medical orders during a live code. The fact that the patient improved after atropine does not prove she understood the full picture in the moment. It proves only that under extreme conditions, multiple clinicians were responding to a rapidly developing situation. Holloway opened the folder in front of him. An elegant sentence, he said mildly. Almost elegant enough. Cole frowned. Colonel. Holloway looked at Claire. Lieutenant Morgan, after I reviewed the file, I visited the surviving members of Raven 6 in recovery. I asked them to confirm Major Cole's account of events. Something shifted in Cole's posture. Not much, enough. Holloway went on. They declined. Claire blinked. General Briggs said nothing. Holloway's voice remained calm, almost conversational. They declined because, in their words, the report was a lie. All 18 men identified a quiet nurse by name as the person who recognized the chemical exposure and initiated treatment. They refused to participate in any press event or commendation tied to Major Cole. They requested you. Cole tried to recover his footing. With respect, Colonel, wounded patients are not objective witnesses. They were chemically compromised, sedated, and traumatized. Holloway turned a page. That concern occurred to me, which is why I requested corroboration from another medical professional present in the room. He nodded toward the side door. Enter. The door opened. Dana Mercer walked in. She wore dress uniform hair, pinned back expression carved from stone. In one hand, she carried a signed statement. If Cole had gone pale when Claire contradicted him, the color now left him altogether. Dana stopped at the table and saluted the general. At ease, Chief Mercer Briggs said. Dana lowered her hand and spoke without waiting for encouragement. Sir, I was the senior nursing officer in the trauma bay during the Raven Rock event. I am here to correct the official record. Cole found his voice first. Dana, be careful. She did not even glance at him. I witnessed Lieutenant Morgan identify the organophosphate pattern before anyone else on the floor. I witnessed Major Cole reject her assessment. I witnessed Lieutenant Morgan retrieve atropine from restricted storage and administer the first life-saving dose to PFC Noah Bennett against direct orders because that patient was actively drowning in his own secretions. I then witnessed PFC Bennett improve almost immediately. I also witnessed the treatment plan for the remaining patients change only after that response became undeniable. The room held very still. Cole stepped toward the table. That is not the full context. Dana turned then finally, and the look she gave him was so flat and cold it stopped him where he stood. The full context, she said, is that I mistook a quiet nurse for a weak one, and nearly helped you kill 18 men because I trusted confidence over competence. Cole opened his mouth. No sound came out. Dana placed the signed statement in front of Holloway. I am prepared to testify under oath to every word. General Briggs sat back in his chair and closed one hand over the velvet metal case. The snap of the lid sounded louder than it should have. He fixed Cole with a stare that held no heat, which was somehow worse. Major Nathan Cole. He said, you are hereby removed from any pending commendation process and relieved of duty. pending formal investigation into falsification of official records, dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming an officer. Cole took one step forward. "General, sir, that is a career-ending overreaction to the confusion of a single mass casualty event." Briggs did not raise his voice. "No, Major. The event was chaotic. Your report was not." Two military police entered at once, as if they had been waiting just outside the room for this exact line to be crossed. Cole looked from Briggs to Holloway to Dana and finally to Claire. What sat in his face then was not remorse. It was disbelief that the structure he trusted had chosen for once not to protect him. He straightened his jacket with both hands, a useless gesture of dignity, and said nothing as the officers escorted him out. The door shut behind them. The room breathed again. Claire stood where she was suddenly aware of the blood rushing in her ears, of how tired she still was from 3 weeks ago, of how strange it felt to be believed in a room designed for power. Holloway rose from his chair. His voice, when he spoke to her, had none of the stiffness it carried before. "Lieutenant Morgan, there are people outside who refused physical therapy this morning until they saw you." He crossed to the double doors that opened onto the adjoining recovery corridor and pulled them wide. The men of Raven 6 were waiting there. Some stood. Some sat in wheelchairs. Some leaned on crutches with knuckles gone white from the effort. Tyler Grant was there, lighter by one leg, and somehow still carrying himself like a man daring the world to comment. Noah Bennett stood with his arm in a sling, too thin now through the face but upright. Marcus Reed sat in a wheelchair at the front, abdominal braces hidden under his recovery shirt, eyes clear and hard. They had dressed for this, not formally. Medically, no one here could manage formal, but every collar was straight. Every blanket was folded down. Every man had made himself presentable in the only way he still could. When Claire stepped into the doorway, Marcus drew in a breath and barked Raven 6 attention. The effect was immediate. The men who could stand pushed themselves upright, even through pain. Those who could not stand lifted their backs and squared their shoulders. Crutches locked. Wheelchair brakes clicked. Then, as 118 right hands rose in salute. Not to the general standing behind her. Not to the colonel. Not to the rank on any collar. To her. Claire felt the hallway blur. For a second she could not lift her own hand. She looked at them and saw all the versions of the night at once. Noah gasping under a slipping oxygen mask. Tyler joking through blood loss on an operating table. Marcus dragging himself back from flatline with a single question about his men. 18 bodies under gray dust. 18 voices now lending her the volume she had never been able to manufacture on her own. She returned the salute. Her hand trembled. She did not care. Tyler broke first because of course he did. About time somebody around here learned who actually runs the room. The men around him laughed, some through pain, some through tears, and the sound cracked the formality wide open. Noah stepped forward one careful pace. Told them, he said, voice still rough. Told every one of them. Marcus looked at Claire with the steady regard of a man who had measured the dark and come back from it. You stood there when everybody else wanted you in the back. We remember that. Claire tried to answer and found absurdly that words had abandoned her now that nobody was dying. Dana came to stand beside her in the doorway. I signed the correction this morning, she said quietly. Claire turned. Dana did not hide from it. Should have done it sooner. Claire looked back at the men in the corridor. You did it when it counted. Dana exhaled, then nodded toward the line of survivors. So did they. The rest of the morning unfolded in pieces that never quite lost their unreal edge. There were revised statements, official corrections, a second chain of custody review that placed Claire's access to the antidote kits exactly where it belonged. Holloway requested a full amendment to the original after-action report. General Briggs spoke to her privately and thanked her in the formal language powerful men used when trying to honor something they knew outranked policy, even if not rank itself. But the part Claire would remember for the rest of her life happened in the corridor before the paperwork, before the clean, corrected language, before anyone attached medals or citations to the things she had done. It happened when 18 wounded soldiers stitched together by surgery and Will refused to let the wrong story stand. Later, as the corridor emptied and physical therapy teams finally convinced the men to return to their schedules, Tyler rolled back toward his room and called over one shoulder. "Lieutenant." Claire turned. "You still thinking about Germany?" She blinked. "How do you know about that?" He grinned. "You have a face. Also, Noah talks too much when medicated." Noah down the hall lifted one hand without shame. Claire almost laughed. Tyler settled more seriously into the chair. "Go if you want, but do not go because loud people got there first." Then he let the orderly wheel him away. By evening, the corrected report was already moving up the chain. Cole's commendation had vanished into investigation. Claire's name, once a footnote under emotional instability and interference, now sat where it should have from the start. Dana Mercer requested that the nursing record reflect direct clinical leadership under catastrophic conditions. Holloway added the patient testimony in full. General Briggs recommended recognition for valor in medical service. Claire read none of it that night. Instead, she stood alone for a few minutes at a window overlooking the Bethesda campus as late light turned the glass gold. Her duffel sat at her feet. In its side pocket, the Germany transfer papers were still folded exactly as before. She took them out, looked at the signature line, then tore the page in half once cleanly and dropped it into the waste bin beside the desk. When she turned, Dana Mercer was standing in the doorway. "Thought I might find you hiding from ceremony logistics." "I was not hiding." Dana raised an eyebrow. Still not loud enough to be convincing. Claire surprised herself by smiling. Dana stepped into the room and handed her a fresh copy of orders. Bethesda put in a request. Temporary assignment at first. Trauma and recovery liaison. They want someone who can see the whole room. Claire looked down at the paper, then back up. "Did you recommend me?" Dana considered that. "I corrected the record. The rest took care of itself." It was the closest Dana Mercer ever came to sentiment, and Claire understood enough now to hear the respect inside it. After Dana left, Claire stood at the window a little longer. Outside, the campus moved with evening calm. Orderlies crossing the path. Families carrying bags from the cafeteria. A therapist pushing an empty wheelchair toward another floor. Somewhere in this building, 18 men were sleeping, healing, hurting, and alive. At Liberty Regional, they had spent months mistaking volume for command, mistaking certainty for vision, mistaking the person in the back of the room for someone meant to stay there. The story had not changed because Claire learned how to shout. She still spoke softly, still watched first, still carried entire worlds in details other people skipped. What changed was simpler and harder than that. When the moment came, she stopped asking permission to trust what she knew. And because she did, 18 soldiers made it home alive enough to ask for her by name.